What if I told you that when you argue with someone about politics, you're not actually arguing about facts at all? You're arguing with their identity. And once identity enters the conversation, facts stop behaving like facts. They become threats. Why do some people look at the exact same evidence you do? Court documents, direct quotes, verified footage, and somehow walk away seeing a completely different reality? Why doesn't the truth change their mind? Why does it make them dig in deeper? Why does it trigger anger, defensiveness, complete rejection? At first glance, it's tempting to think they're just ignoring the truth. They're being irrational. They don't want to listen. But that explanation is too simple. And more importantly, it's wrong. Because what you're witnessing is not a failure of intelligence. It's not a lack of information. It's a deeply wired psychological defense system doing exactly what it evolved to do: protect the self. To understand this, we have to step outside politics for a moment. Forget parties, forget candidates, and look at something more fundamental: how the human brain protects identity. When social psychologists began studying intense political loyalty, they expected to find strong correlations with policy preferences, things like taxes, trade, immigration, logical, issue-based alignment. But the data told a very different story. Support wasn't primarily about policy. It was about psychology. Two traits kept appearing again and again in the research: right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. Now, these terms get thrown around a lot, often misunderstood. So let's slow down and actually unpack them. Social dominance orientation is the belief, often unconscious, that society should be structured hierarchically. Some groups lead, others follow. Order is maintained through clear ranking. For people high in this trait, stability matters more than flexibility. Structure matters more than fluidity. Predictability matters more than change. Now imagine what happens when the world starts shifting. Cultural norms evolve. Demographics change. Power structures become less clear. To some, that feels like progress. To others, it feels like loss. Not just political loss, identity loss. There's a term for this feeling. It doesn't mean someone is objectively losing everything. It means they feel like their group is losing status, influence, recognition. And that feeling is powerful, because humans are not just individuals. We're social beings. We define ourselves through groups. So when someone feels like their group is slipping, they don't just want solutions, they want restoration. And that's where leadership becomes psychological. At this point, a leader is no longer just a policymaker. He becomes a symbol of order, of control, of identity. And the stronger and more decisive that leader appears, the more psychologically reassuring he becomes. Now here's where things take a turn, because everything works fine until reality conflicts with belief. What happens when that leader does something controversial, something serious, something that clearly contradicts the values his supporters claim to hold? Logically, support should decrease. That's what most people expect. But in reality, something very different happens. Support doesn't collapse. It often hardens. Why? Because of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when two conflicting ideas collide in your mind. I support this person. This person did something wrong. That conflict creates tension, real, measurable psychological discomfort, and the brain hates that discomfort. So it resolves it, not necessarily by changing the belief, but by changing the interpretation of reality. This is where the defense mechanisms begin. First comes denial. This isn't real. The media is lying. The evidence is fake. Even when the source is credible, even when the facts are verified, because rejecting the evidence is easier than rebuilding your identity. Then comes deflection. What about the other side? They've done worse. This is called whataboutism. It shifts the focus, not to find truth, but to restore emotional balance. And then comes the most fascinating response of all: value shifting. People who once said character matters most suddenly say only results matter. Not because they truly changed their beliefs overnight, but because their beliefs had to adapt to protect something deeper, their sense of self. Now here's where it gets even more surprising. You might assume this behavior is chaotic, emotional, unstructured, but research shows the opposite. Many of the most loyal individuals score extremely high in a personality trait called conscientiousness. That means they are disciplined, organized, rule-oriented, structured. In other words, they crave order, and when the world feels chaotic, they become even more attached to whatever provides that order. This is where another concept comes in: the threat to identity. There's a psychological principle called identity protective cognition. This is the key to everything. When a belief becomes part of your identity, challenging that belief doesn't feel like a discussion. It feels like an attack, and the brain reacts accordingly. The amygdala, which detects threats, activates, and in that moment, logic shuts down. The brain is no longer asking, "Is this true?" It's asking, "Am I under threat?" And once that happens, everything changes. Facts become weapons, questions become attacks, conversations become battles, and doubling down becomes self-defense. Because admitting you were wrong doesn't just mean changing your mind. It can feel like losing a piece of yourself. That's why debates like this feel impossible, because you're not operating in the same space. One person is discussing evidence, the other is protecting identity, and those are two completely different processes. But here's the part most people overlook. This isn't unique to one group or one political belief. This is human nature. Everyone has beliefs tied to identity. Everyone has areas where they resist uncomfortable truths. Everyone has moments where their brain chooses protection over accuracy. The only difference is where that line is drawn. So what does this mean for you? It means that if your goal is to win an argument with facts, you will almost always fail. Not because your facts are wrong, but because facts alone can't penetrate a defended identity. If you actually want to reach someone, the process has to start somewhere else. Not with evidence, not with confrontation, but with safety. Because only when the brain feels safe does it allow itself to question identity. And only when identity is flexible can truth actually be considered. So the next time you find yourself asking, "How can they not see this?" remember this: they're not just seeing information, they're protecting who they are. And until that changes, nothing else will. If this shifted your perspective, stay here, because understanding psychology at this level changes how you see everything, not just politics, but people and yourself.